All right, welcome everybody to the advanced session for the storage working group. In terms of an intro, I just wanted to make sure that we're setting the table for what you guys should expect for this session. So this is a quote-unquote roundtable. It's not exactly round in the room, so the chairs are set up for presentation, but the intent of this session was for existing and new storage working group members so that we could talk about the charter and the mandate and discuss like what we're going to be working on over the next few months. So we're not going to go through a bunch of slides and do a deep dive. It's just going to be a conversation among the SWG members to talk about what's going on. So that's kind of the expectation. So if you guys are interested and you want to participate, please hang around. We're glad to have everybody here. Is that? Can I also get a kind of a show of hands just so we understand, who in the room has actually attended an SWG meeting before, the storage working group? So who's new? Oh wait. What's that? Oh, sorry, yeah. So who's new? A lot. Okay. So it's about a little bit more than half is new. Okay. So the first thing that we wanted to cover is the ask of the CNCF, like, what is storage at the CNCF? If you guys attended the intro session, which we had already, we kind of covered the landscape that we've been discussing. Why is storage important? What does storage look like? How does it work? What are the different components that we find in the architectures? But I think a lot of that is captured, from the intention of the CNCF for storage in this sentence right here. The CNCF intends to enable a thriving storage ecosystem that is vendor and platform neutral and interoperable for applications. Right, so I think that last piece is really the key when it comes to the cloud native environments. At all times when we think about what's happening, or when we think about different components working together, it's all about the user experience. It's all about making sure that these applications can consume storage services really transparently and abstract of what cloud they're in, whether they're on-prem, off-prem, storage platform, it really shouldn't matter. So that's kind of the goal with a lot of the work that we're doing, is just enable these neutral environments that enable a cloud native experience for storage and applications. These are the three priorities that we really wanted to talk about today and describe what they mean. We've actually got TOC members here today to help us with these and to clarify and to dig in deeper. We've got Alexis in the back of the room. We'll be running the mic back there when we have questions for him. And then we've got Ben, of course, up in the front. And I think is Quinton in the room? No, we don't have Quinton in right now, but he may join us in a few minutes as well. So the first priority that we're talking about here as a group is this top one. So clarify the terminology and landscape. Go ahead.
Let's do one more poll. How many folks work in storage today? If you could raise your hand, like they work at a storage company, or they... Okay. How many folks are here just because they're interested in using storage in their clusters or doing stateful stuff? Okay. So... hopefully somehow you can use that to decide which ones you want to spend the roundtable on.
Yeah. I'd actually like to probably ask a question of someone in the audience. Maybe you can answer the top one for us. Who here has been actively looking at the storage ecosystem in cloud native and been confused, seeing mixed messages, not really knowing where to go? Anybody want to describe their challenges in the cloud native storage space?
So, I mean, this is more a general point. I think, so I spent a long time in the OpenStack community, and, I used to work in storage development at IBM and operated very large Ceph clusters for a living. And it does strike me that there seems to be less of a pull for standardization than there was in OpenStack. OpenStack, Cinder, that was it. That's the mechanism by which that's going to happen. And it feels like things are not yet at least that's my impression over the last year, that things haven't quite got to that state yet. And that may or may not be true, right? But
I think that that's a fair comment. There's been 2 projects that have come into the CNCF Foundation, or CNCF, that are storage related, Vitesse and Rook, right? And if you look at those projects, like Rook is an orchestration tool for storage platforms. So you can run, different persistent applications on top of Kubernetes, essentially. And then you've got Vitesse, which is a sharding technology for MySQL. So you can make MySQL horizontally scale. Underneath those things, you may consider that there's like specifications, which I think is what causes the ecosystem to not splinter anymore. Like people focus on the specs and things get better. The one spec which is ongoing right now is CSI, right? And that's addressing like the block volume support in the ecosystem. And that's been a great thing for everybody so far. And so I think that, bringing the ecosystem together and rallying around something, it just takes time. Like sometimes you have to innovate with all these higher level projects, and then that drives down into creating specs. I don't know if that.
yeah, no, it does kind of answer the question. I mean, I suppose definitely in the early days of OpenStack, it felt like there was a real push from the storage vendors. It definitely felt like in the early days of OpenStack that there was a big push from the storage vendor community to move to that position, because they were all desperate to provide, that support to their customers who wanted to use OpenStack, right? And perhaps there are less folks wanting to use SANs and stuff these days, in this kind of environment,
Does anybody else have any other, stories about doing the research in cloud native storage, being confused by it, having a lack of common knowledge? Do we think that that's a problem? Like, is this something that is going to be valuable if the storage working group tackles an idea of creating a white paper that describes the ecosystem and the components and how things work together? Is that going to help bring people together? Anybody want to comment on that? Like, has that worked in other areas? Any examples of that? I think the serverless working group did that recently, and I think that's been, people have kind of widely accepted that was a great thing to do to help educate. And from a storage working group perspective, this is one of the things that we've wanted to do for a while. I think that in order to move forward, right, it's the white papers and the specs that allow us to build this like common knowledge and common way of working together. And I definitely feel pretty strongly that if we can get this white paper done, that we'll be able to kind of move on to more interesting topics in storage in the future.
Why don't we dig into the first one? I think that's probably the easiest one to dig into. I think we can just use this as a working session, since that's what the original plan was. Why don't we dive into the things that we know that we want to make sure we've got clear definitions for. We've got a great crowdsourced audience here that can help provide some insight into whether or not these definitions make sense, as well as I think it could make sense to share what we currently think about the landscape and get some feedback from folks about, again, whether or not this makes sense. I think, again, if we could just get a raise of hands of the folks that have joined the working group and probably will continue to join the working group in the future. I think it's a pretty small number we have today. We've got 8 or so. So for those folks, this is actually a really great opportunity to get feedback from everybody else in the room. And if there's anything else you guys would love to get feedback on when it comes to what the working group's trying to do in storage, I think we can do that. No, you can do it, yeah.
So we presented this slide at the intro session, and I'll give you guys the quick elevator pitch on it, and we can chat about it. The purpose of this is basically saying that storage comes in many forms. You've got kind of the the bottommost part, which is the north-south activity, where you have the kernel and it's issuing storage requests, et cetera, down to disks and things like that. Maybe it's remote storage, maybe it's local storage, but you're essentially accessing LBA or logical blocks, or you're accessing files. And that's what we have the volume functionality to participate in. That's where the CSI functionality actually works for. And then you've got the east and west activity, which is also storage. And those may be key value stores, and maybe NoSQL databases, right? Those are all, you're storing data there as well, but they're more structured. But when it comes to the charter of the group, right, we're looking at both of these things. And the idea is that we want to kind of focus on it from a top-down perspective. We want the user experience to be consistent. So whether you're using volumes or whether you're using databases east-west, right, the user shouldn't really care. They run their app, and then under the covers, the app connects to the storage that's relevant.
Though it seems like there's a pretty fundamental difference, though, in the way this access actually happens and the way people are actually consuming it. Since all network-based services generally are using custom APIs, the application is aware, right, that it's not making direct POSIX calls. It's not doing everything mediated through the kernel. So in some ways, like, these are just generic network services that happen to store state, right? So I'm not sure that it really fits the same pattern.
Hi. How's it going, Jesse? I'm not sure the distinction holds, though. NFS. Like, it's a standard file protocol, but it goes over networking.
But it also goes through the kernel and the application itself.
It doesn't have to. There's user-space clients. Right? And S3, it's a pretty standard protocol. It goes over network. Right? I mean, like it or not, S3 is effectively the de facto object file protocol, right? So it's not the distinction that I would have made. I didn't even know it was you talking, Jesse. Jesse and I love to disagree. Anyway, that was all I wanted to say. Like, I think it's more nuanced than just network or not network.
Thank you. So what do you guys think? Is this a decent way to talk about storage in cloud native? From a top-down, you've got a user experience you're trying to provide. There's a couple different ways that storage is being accessed, but from a working group, right, this is the picture we're trying to tackle. Any likes, dislikes? Yep.
Thanks. Sorry, this is probably naive since I'm not a storage expert, but in terms of networking, when you're working from an application perspective and deploying your containers, you don't actually care at all about the network. Why can't this be done for the storage aspect? So I would not actually have to specify anything in my deployment relative to the storage classes, for example. I mean, storage classes are an improvement, but they're not actually. When you want to go across different storage, you actually have to change your classes. And that means that you also change your deployment file, which makes your deployment not portable. So why can't the storage group actually address it in a way so that you basically feel like you have a storage, but you don't actually have to care about how this is specified? Somebody else will actually give you that. It just becomes available from the container perspective. Very similar to how you actually add blocks in a VM on Amazon, for example. I don't know, maybe it's a stupid thing. I'm not really sure what you think about that.
I think in that case, the difference is whether or not you can actually provide a sort of universal API to something, right? I don't think the storage working group's job is or should be to try to define new APIs that encapsulate other APIs, right? For maybe to take a slight spin on the slide on the board, there's things that are obviously network and there are things that are not obviously network, right? NFS is not obviously network. It pretends to be a local file system, right? Block devices they can be local or they can be network, and they're not obviously so. SQL databases, they're pretty obviously network, right? And maybe that distinction sort of holds more. It also holds more with the API sense, like as an application, if you're using a file system, you probably don't care how that file system is implemented. If you are, very rare cases, right? And if you're using a SQL database, you actually probably care what characteristics of SQL you're going to be using.
And I think to your point, Tim, like it is whether or not the way you're accessing it is like this already a standardized agreed upon API, right? So is it like fopen? Are you going through making like direct kernel syscalls, or is it a library that you loaded in that's then constructing packets or RESTful API or whatever, right?
So do you guys see all that stuff on the right-hand side about other data storage types? Do you see that as in scope for the storage working group? Because, I mean, you know, to me, looking at that, you know, the kind of distinction there is between this stuff is kind of at the operating system layer, right? This stuff is at the application layer. Your application needs to know about these things that are on the right. And that's kind of, you know, to me is the differentiator between those two things. Not necessarily whether it's, networked is kind of, you know, irrelevant or relevant, right? I mean, some of that stuff you could connect to it locally on some socket, or, you know, it doesn't necessarily need to be over a network.
I think, feedback from me on the slide is I think networking probably doesn't matter because it can be one way or another. And so maybe that's I think just the idea of east-west activity, north-south activity may be clarifying enough, and adding kernel and networking in here may just confuse it. Does anybody want to respond to his question about, you know, whether it should be in scope or out of scope? Saad, did you?
Go ahead. You want to try one? No? I was going to just comment on something else. I was going to say I agree with Jesse. The difference is not networking between north-south and east-west. I think the difference is whether your application actually needs to be aware of what it's talking to or not. In the case of the things that are north-south here, that the operating system takes care of that, so that the application doesn't need to, and since we're not in the data path, we can do magic here with CSI, whereas everything over here doesn't necessarily have a standard data API, which makes it much more difficult for us to build a standardized system on top of. So it does lead to the natural question whether this should or should not be part of the purview of this group.
I mean, I agree with it, except I don't think it's static. I think the definition shifts over time, right? I would say 5 years ago, this would have been a fairly accurate representation, and today, even though I work at a place that doesn't make S3, I would say S3 is the de facto standard, and like we just have to suck that up. And so maybe that one starts to shift to the other side, and like, no, we don't really have an effective fuse sort of virtualization over objects, but you could sort of imagine that, and it seems like it's reasonable, and it shifts from the obviously networked category to the not obviously networked category, or maybe abstracted and not abstracted categories, right? I saw a hand over there.
And I think from a standardization point of view, it does make sense to address documents as networking, because if you look from, I want to access persistent data, it should be an abstract layer where I can access objects underneath, whether it's an S3 bucket or it's a file, shouldn't be relevant from a standard point of view in the storage plane sense, if that makes sense.
It's actually a good segue. I'd argue that one of the coolest things about Kubernetes was that adding a volume abstraction, persistent volume, and adding dynamic volume provisioning around it enabled the deployment of Kubernetes and opening a number of scenarios across many hosted solutions of Kubernetes and deployments. Imagine if we had, to Tim's point, a persistent bucket that spoke S3, or maybe even a persistent database, and that gets a little more complicated. And we even had, dynamic bucket provisioning and dynamic database provisioning, right? I'd argue that the same value we're extracting out of volumes today in Kubernetes would apply to bucket and to databases and other forms of storage in the same way, regardless of how, whether it's you're going over a network or those are implementation details at some level. But enabling somebody who's writing an app to say not only declare the deployments and replica sets and other primitives, but also to be able to say that I've got a database, or I have a volume, or I have other constructs that are stateful, is quite helpful from a user experience standpoint.
So as a follow-up comment to what you just said, I think one reason persistent volumes work fine is because Kubernetes is primarily a control plane concept. For data plane, POSIX is basically the API that applications use to deal with files or logs. Whereas with documents, log streams, time series, if you have a persistent bucket or persistent database, that can help with provisioning maybe, but not with data plane operations, which are quite different across different time series, different log streams, different databases, and that's where the problem comes.
Yeah.
My name is Wei. I'm from VMware, and I think I came here really just to listen, actually. But it's kind of mind-opening for me to attend a work group. And so I'm very grateful I actually came to this session. And so I think when I came here, I really think we're only talk about the CSI. So to me, on the right-hand side, it really seems to me the Kubernetes connecting to the service provider, but I guess that's what data service is meant for. So I think, to me, I'm very new to this group, so I think we should be focusing all on the left-hand side. I think that's the definition we should target it for. That's my opinion.
I kind of disagree. They're all storage. We should consider them, but in the same time, you have I also agree, because I think that's the big split, right? You have general purpose, regardless of what that is. You have your general purpose, and then you have your specialized types, where you have your specialized and you can only store documents in it. You cannot just throw a random binary. And I think that's the big distinction between the two types that we need to make.
Okay, one more here.
In fact, it's another question that I have. I wonder if it's possible to virtualize the storage in a way that it would be possible to define a single LUN that would be managed by the container ecosystem to provide smaller chunks to individual containers. A little bit like hypervisors are doing.
Anybody have any follow-up on that? Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So, in my mind at least, and I'm a storage idiot in the sense that I can't do much anything else. But all the things on the right side, what they have in common is they need the piece on the left side. So that's, to me, just the common denominator. And whenever you have a database, whatever database it is, eventually it will need blocks or a file system, right? And so talking about documents, log streams, and whatever, to me, that's not relevant for the storage aspect itself. So I'm not saying that it's necessarily a bad idea, but I think it convolutes the subject a lot.
This is just a comment. So a lot of technologies for document stores, log stream, time series, they've been around before containers and Kubernetes. And the way they're consumed wouldn't really change if you're deploying them inside containers and pods, it's the same. I can see containers or technologies like operators, the way Rook works, can help with deploying these technologies, but in terms of consumption, I don't see really much difference between how they're used outside of the cloud native landscape versus how they're used inside the cloud native landscape. Maybe somebody can comment on that. Yeah.
I'm glad I get a third try. I'm concerned with it. So to your question, should this be CSI, like this group? This group is specifically the CNCF storage working group, not just Kubernetes SIG storage, right? So Kubernetes, if this were a Kubernetes SIG storage meeting, we'd probably all be talking about how awesome CSI is going to be. And it will be, right, Saad? This group has a broader charter. Well, I mean, presumably, I think we're sort of still defining the charter, really. But I see the charter as forward-looking. I see the charter as defining what we think the best practices are, the best technologies are for cloud-native operation. I mean, that is really the mission of the Cloud Native Compute Foundation, is to help people figure out what the best techniques and the best technologies are. And I think another way to distinguish your north, south, and east, west would be legacy, cloud native. I think that for me, if I can wax philosophical for just a second, cloud nativeness is about decoupling. It's about having less tie-ins to less things. You mount a file system, you're tied to the OS, you're tied to the file system, you're tied to the block device. You go a block device, well, at least you get rid of the file system, right? You go to an object store, well, now you're not even tied to a physical machine, like you don't have hardware, you can run from any machine in the network, and the more decoupled you get, the more cloud native you are, right? The more freedom you have to move, the more expandability and scalability you can capture in your application. To me, that's the heart of cloud nativeness. It's also about elasticity and the ability to get more of something when you need it, just like that, right?
Although, to be fair, even in an object store, it's files on some disk.
Sure, but not to you, right? It's like serverless. Well, there's no such thing as serverless. It's serverless to you. Yeah. There's a server somewhere, right? But because of SLAs and guarantees that you make for these API-driven services, you get to pretend that that doesn't exist, right? And that's the power of cloud native, and that's the thing that CNCF is trying to capture. And so I see the purpose of a white paper here not necessarily to standardize. We're not going to sit here and define a new API that encompasses all true SQLs. We're not empowered or endowed with that authority, right? What we can do is characterize, categorize, taxonomize the various storage technologies that we have and make recommendations for people about how these things fit with the cloud native ethos and when they're appropriate, when they're not appropriate, and how they're likely to be implemented and what the likely failure modes are and how those things fit into different categories. And I think that's where the information comes in, where we get to take people who are not here at KubeCon, right? This is sort of the elite of the elite. We go to the rest of the world and we say, this is what we think is the best way to consume cloud native stuff, right? I think we're already getting there with compute because we've got things like containers and Kubernetes. The next obvious thing is data. And I think that that's the charter here. Thanks for my rant.
Just to follow up, I guess what you could say is you should have usage patterns for workloads using data, is to your point. So if you can taxonomize that, that would be helpful for the larger audience.
Tim, do you think is that just about the consumption side of it, or is it about the operations and management side of those kind of things, right? So, I mean, if I go back a little bit and look at something like Ceph, for example, from an architectural perspective, is, you know, on a certain paradigm is a fantastic way of managing storage, right? Because you end up with all these things that are pretty much exactly the same. You scale them just by adding more of them. You manage it all in exactly the same way, which was a completely different thing from how we did storage before those kinds of distributed storage systems came in. So I guess what my question is, do you see that side of how do you operate and manage those kind of storage systems as being as important as how do you consume that storage?
I think that's a really great distinction. And I personally think we should be focusing on how people consume right now. It's great that we can take systems like Rook, like Ceph, like all these, you know, Storage OS, like Portworx, like all these other things that are going to turn the management of storage into a cloud native problem also, right? But at the end of the day, there's a turtle at the bottom. And the turtle at the bottom is not cloud native, right? Even inside Google, at the bottom of the stack, there's a bunch of physical machines that are in physical racks that have real wires plugged into them. And there's a bunch of poor people who run around with carts all day and fix them, right? And that's not cloud native. And that's fine. Like we accept reality, right?
Somebody has to be poor at the bottom.
They're not poor. But somebody somewhere is carrying the load so that the rest of us can build more elegant systems on top. And for now, a lot of storage is that, right? So you take a system like Ceph, which turns non-cloud native storage into cloud native storage, right? Awesome. And you don't get 1-to-1. You buy 10 terabytes of physical disk, you don't get 10 terabytes of Ceph, right? I don't know what the ratio exactly is with Ceph, but you pay something for the privilege of cloud nativizing it. You heard that word here first. And so that's my feeling. I really think what we owe to our users is to talk about how to consume storage in the safest, most scalable, most elastic, least coupled ways.
Okay, we'll go to behind me, but then I do think this is a good opportunity to hear from folks about the value of this discussion versus, I think there was another comment back there around, this all rolls down to, at the end of the day, it's just file systems and disks and the value of that coupled with the operation side of those pieces.
Okay, if you look, let's say, at a normal, let's say, file system, you have to think about how do you make, let's say, the file system layout with inodes and all the stuff. If you look at object, you don't have this anymore. You can scale to billions of things. You have systems which have this eventual consistency, so you have your HTTP point where you go for your S3 traffic, and you have systems with strong consistency. So you can really get there from multiple places. You have load balancers in front of it. You have metadata. Metadata is consistent with the objects. So you don't need to build some, let's say, NoSQL database. And probably if the file changes, the link from the NoSQL to Ceph is not valid anymore. You have problems with that. So we have seen customers. If you look, let's say, for Oracle, you have this Airman can go to S3. So a lot of applications have the S3 as a target there. And as it's IP-based, I think it's really cloud native in this way. You can deal with that. You have some people also building search things in. So if you want to transfer something from this bucket, you can decide only give me those things with these attributes and send it over. It's a totally different approach. And I feel this is something which makes value.
Although it depends when you say that all applications are. In reality, the people are still writing applications that have hard requirements for IOPS and stuff like that, and people still want to do that stuff in containers. That's why people want to add volumes to containers, right? If nobody cared about that stuff, we wouldn't even have to worry about volumes because everybody could just use object storage and, that would be fine.
If our mission is to cloud nativize everybody, then we start somewhere. We started with compute, and I'd say we're winning that war. Storage, if that's the next topic, it's a transition, right? We can't snap our fingers and have overnight everybody rewrite their applications to use object store. If we could, they'd all be better for it probably, but we can't do that, right? And I think the real value is in the decoupling and the less stuff you have to worry about to make things happen that you have to worry about. I'm not saying nobody has to worry about, right? But that you have to worry about, or that you're willing to put money up for the privilege to not worry about. And if I drew my own spectrum of cloud nativeness, right, I'd probably put files pretty far on the left of not cloud native, and I'd put object pretty far on the right of pretty cloud native. That doesn't mean that there aren't billions of applications out there that read files.
I think one of the questions, though, especially when we start talking about a lot of these network services, are there common elements? What are those common elements? Is this a taxonomy, or is literally every single solution different enough that there's very little common elements here? We can't come up with a standard API for these things because they're just different enough, and everybody uses them differently enough that you can't swap them, like SQL, for instance, right? Like, it takes a pretty trivial implementation to be able to swap between MySQL, Postgres, and Oracle and have it actually work.
I think it's also worth going back to what is the purpose of this group. We can sit here and philosophize about storage all day. But ultimately, we need to make sure that we understand what the deliverables for this group are and what the purpose behind those deliverables are. It sounds like, Quinton, you might be able to explain this more, what the TOC wants out of this group. It sounds like it might be taxonomy, a landscape, and then the TOC uses that to inform decisions for the TOC.
I think as Tim mentioned earlier, we do ultimately want to get to some kind of recommendations saying, this stuff works well in cloud native environments, and this stuff, or my personal opinion is that there are actually many use cases, and it's very difficult to say this is better way of doing storage and this is a worse way. It's very application dependent. So I would like to just understand the strengths and weaknesses of different approaches for different applications. But I think before we even get there, we just need to come up with a common set of terminology. We need to understand how people are doing things today. I mean, people are doing stuff in cloud native land today with NetApp filers, EMC boxes, local disks, Ceph. There are many different ways of doing this. And I think just getting an understanding of what that landscape looks like, and from the people who are actually doing it, why did you do it that way and not the other way? Because it was better for our application, and what problems did you run into? I think that information is very useful as a sort of baseline to have the subsequent discussions about, in general, what categories exist, what are they good for, what are they bad for, etc.
I was just going to say, do we have any numbers on those kind of questions about, what's the penetration into the community of things like NetApp filers or EMC arrays or whatever from any of the user surveys?
I think the best thing that I've seen so far are the surveys that CNCF has done. So they've got surveys about the different types of usage of storage platforms, I think specific to Kubernetes right now, but I think Mesosphere probably has some of this information as well. But there's some information out there. Okay, we're going to close it out. That was actually really fantastic. So thank you guys all for participating. The working group talks about this stuff all the time. So you'll find our meetings every other Wednesday. We're either hearing from technology within the industry, so projects or products come to present to us about what they're doing and how they're thinking about cloud native, or we're going to be talking about philosophizing about storage, just like this. So thank you guys very much. Enjoy the rest of your show, and looking forward to seeing you at our meetings. Thank you.